Welcome to Imagine Otherwise, the podcast about the people and projects bridging art, activism, and academia to build better worlds. Episodes offer in-depth interviews with creators who use culture for social justice and explore the nitty-gritty work of imagining otherwise. I'm your host, Cathy Hannabach. Welcome back, you fabulous Imagine Otherwise listeners. Thanks for supporting Chris, Michelle, and I as we took a much-needed July production break. We're back now, and we have some fantastic episodes lined up for you. To kick things off, today's episode tackles something that I know many of you are navigating right now: how to take your courses online in the middle of a pandemic while also making them truly accessible to students and faculty alike. More than just a call to reproduce in-person teaching in digital environments, this pivot to online education has a powerful potential to help us reshape higher education for the better, to ensure it embodies the racial, gender, and disability justice principles those of us in the interdisciplines have long championed. But that takes rethinking some of our most basic assumptions about what education means and who it's for. My guest today is Temple University Media Studies professor Adrienne Shaw, whose approach to the classroom provides a variety of ways educators can foreground accessibility in their daily work. And as many of you know, Adrienne is also my wife. I wanted to have her on the show to illustrate some of the more practical aspects of what it means to do pedagogical and scholarly work in quarantine, as well as the kinds of work-life blurriness that we're all navigating right now. In our interview, Adrienne and I chat about building assignments and course structures that enable students to participate in diverse ways, why online teaching is often more accessible for faculty with chronic pain and other disabilities, how administrators can better support teachers and mitigate uncertainty, and why creating accessible education systems by design rather than exception is key to how Adrienne imagines otherwise. Thanks so much for being with us today, Adrienne. I know this is a little weird interviewing you from our own house, and this is a new experience, but let's just see how it goes.
Yes. Just try not to be too loud because I'm recording an interview.
Exactly. So let's just jump in. I know for the past many months, I've watched you do this. I've watched my friends do this. I've watched my colleagues and my clients do this as professors across the country and really the world have been frantically redoing their syllabi, getting intimately familiar with Zoom fatigue, and generally trying to figure out how to make their fall teaching situation better than the kind of on-the-fly version that they were forced to enact this past spring. So maybe before we jump into some of the specifics, can you tell our listeners what is your fall teaching lineup and how are you structuring those classes?
Sure. So for the past 3 years, every fall, I've co-taught 2 classes with my colleague, Professor Laura Zalia. They're both classes that merge media production with research. And so one is an MA workshop class that is designed to get our MA students who are doing a creative project to finish their degree, get them set up so that they can finish by the end of spring. So it's sort of a structured workshopping class. And then mobile media, which is an undergraduate class focused on mobile media, which is a weird concept to think about in the middle of a pandemic when people can't be particularly mobile. And so we've found ways to restructure those assignments so that they make use of technology that students can have regardless of where they are. So we found software that is easy to use regardless of what kinds of devices they might be working on, largely free software that is free to them as Temple students, or software that allows them to edit video on their mobile phone, or really easy to use downloadable tools like Audacity for audio projects, and focusing the assignments themselves on reflecting about what it means to design media for non-mobile audiences, but through mobile means. And then I teach technology and culture as a solo class. It's actually one of the classes I taught in the spring and had to shift online. So I'm applying a lot of what I learned in that weird moment where suddenly I had to throw all of my lesson plans out the window and sort of move everything online simultaneously. And that was useful because it allowed me to figure out what does and doesn't work for my online classes. So for every class, I pre-record the lecture and upload those to YouTube playlists for each class, and then have a live Zoom session during what would have been class time. And those live Zoom sessions are focused on answering students' questions, having a more engaged discussion based on students' discussion questions, and then doing activities that sort of bring people together and have them think through the readings together, and then having them do additional discussion in Slack, which is where they post their discussion questions. So there's both a synchronous and asynchronous element to all of the classes.
One thing that we've talked a lot about, and I've seen you kind of go through variations of, is wrestling with the synchronicity question and how that enables or prevents different students from participating, right? Like there's a value to live in-person conversations that mimic what happens in a physical classroom. But I know something that you've run into a lot is a lot of times students can't really do that for a variety of reasons, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, for all of my class designs, I've opted to treat the live Zoom session as a bonus, as a thing that is just there for people who can do it. But if you can't do it, you don't actually miss out on the class, right? So the lectures are pre-recorded, one, so that anybody who can't join the live session gets that experience. But also, I mean, we've had internet problems even while I was trying to lead my classes. And so not having students miss half of a lecture because their internet crapped out for a minute and then they had to sign back on. So the lectures are there and accessible to any student whenever they want to engage it. And then for the Slack discussions, those discussion questions are one that I always use in class, where I incorporate them into the class discussion. But I'm having students also respond to them on Slack. So anybody who can't join that live session can still be part of the discussion. And what I've done as an instructor, instead of recording the live sessions, which I feel engages in a lot of weird privacy issues, anything that got said in the live discussion that I thought would be particularly useful or interesting for everybody, I incorporate that into my own posts in the Slack discussion. So if one student said something really interesting in response to the reading, I might tag them in my discussion response and say, Phil said this really interesting thing regarding this reading by Ryan Milner. Maybe he can elaborate again on what he was saying here. I'll try to summarize. And so I find it's my job to make sure that the students who can't make that live session don't lose out, but that for the students who do make the live session, there's a reason it's live. And that's largely through the kinds of activities we do and the kinds of discussion we do. I don't want to have them sign into a Zoom meeting and just listen to me talk, right? They can have the video where they get to listen to me talk. It's meant to be that sort of the people who really want it and can do it, and the people who can't do it aren't somehow being disadvantaged by not being able to do that.
You mentioned internet crapping out, both your own experience, my own experience, as well as your students' experience. And this gets us at something that I think in a lot of the conversations, well-meaning conversations perhaps, amongst faculty who are, wrestling with these brand new transitions, often coming down from above from administrators, is that they're trying to figure out how to make these radical changes to their teaching structures without much university or administrative support for building an infrastructure that would enable that, right? So like whether that's needing to upgrade to high-speed internet, which I know you and I have had to do. We had to pay for the next tier or whatever from Comcast in order to make our jobs work in these conditions. But also things like, how do you maintain privacy when you're broadcasting live video from your home? And what does your home look like? And what does that reveal about you? And what kinds of assumptions are audience members going to make about that, and who can afford to do that and stuff. So I would love to talk about some of those kind of material constraints or contexts. And maybe we can start by talking about what are some of the changes that we've had to make to our house to make our jobs working from home actually work.
Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously there's the upgrading the internet example. I mean, I think we spent probably a week's worth of hours troubleshooting the internet. And I mean, my office was a dead zone apparently. And so figuring out how to, even with this new upgraded internet, how to get it to work in my office, despite the fact that for some reason it doesn't work on this side of the house, right? For no apparent reason, even when the router was in my office, for some reason, my computer was super slow. And so
There's something about the walls in your office that just do not like internet.
No, they're like, I don't know, maybe when they added this edition, they put in a Faraday cage or something, and that just encompasses where my computer sits. And so like going through multiple different router options and extenders and finally finding, Xfi pods on eBay and buying one and then going through a week of troubleshooting to figure out how to make that work the best. I think I spent, in the spring, I just used Zoom, my headset that I've always used for my computer, because I've done a lot of projects where I had to have Skype meetings. And so I've already been used to engaging in like online video conference chats, and just sort of record and go from there, not really think too much about it. But at the start of summer, I rearranged the pictures on my wall because, all of our wedding photos were behind me. And so I moved them so that they're...
Which are lovely, but
no, they're perfectly
not all
lovely.
Students probably care or...
But, it's, one, they might not care, but also I feel like that was revealing personal things about me that I don't necessarily reveal to my students. And so I put up things that are a little more neutral in terms of who I am. Like they're still, the kinds of things I have up on my office walls, like nerdy posters or pictures of places I've been. I spent a lot of time, I used your webcam, I used my laptop webcam, I used my computer webcam, trying to figure out what the best webcam configuration is for how I wanted to record, even though I know that the vast majority of the time I'm recording myself as this tiny little square at the top of a PowerPoint image in a video that's 10 minutes. But like making sure all of that works, test shooting different audio setups, figuring out how to set up the microphone so that it would record the best while minimizing other noises. Testing different free or free to me via Temple video editing software, because like on the one hand, I've really tried to do all of my lectures in one take. They're short because I think that more students will watch them that way, but also they're short so that I can get through it in one take. But sometimes it's easier to just edit some things out. And so finding easy but not expensive editing software so I can cut out that one section where my computer was flipping out about something. And then discovering, like, depending on how the sun moves through the sky, what times of day I can in fact shoot in my office and what days I can't because it's too bright and it basically washes out the entire camera. And I think every single person I know who's at least spent their summer thinking about recording has been dealing with those same issues. I know people who actually bought video cameras so that they could record their lectures outside. I know other people who are trying to find ways, who use different Zoom backgrounds to hide what their apartment looks like. I don't like those because they cut off my hair in weird ways. But they don't work on everybody's computer. I feel like half of our spring faculty meetings were people playing around with what they wanted their Zoom persona to be, because for a lot of us, we've spent decades creating our in-class, this is what we wear to class persona, and suddenly it's like, what is that behind me in my home office, right? Or we had to buy an air conditioner. We had to buy an air conditioner for the second floor because we're not usually both working here all summer long. Like if it gets too hot, I always had the option to go to campus, and I don't have that option anymore, or go to a coffee shop or something. I'll say one of the other things I do too is that in order to break up recording lots of lectures, I've recorded probably 25 lectures between the end of May and the end of July. And in order to break it up, I have a costume change in between each lecture. And, it's silly. Most of the students won't notice, but it helps me feel like each is a discrete moment. And it feels like it's important to at least pretend like these are different days, even if I'm recording, 5 in a row because the construction next door is stopped for a period of time that I have no idea how long it stopped for. So I'm going to record as many things as I can before they start again, or because the neighbors' kids are loud. So it's a lot of like doing as much as I can within the constraints of where I'm trying to record, which is not an environment I can really control.
Scheduling is also something that we've dealt with a lot, right? I know in the in the spring, when you're doing this kind of on the fly, and I'm also having to make adaptations on the fly, we did as much as possible to make sure that, and this was when we have crappier internet, where we tried to not be on Zoom at the same time because it would take out the internet for both of us. And so we set up a shared Google Calendar, which we already have anyway, just to keep track of stuff. But we made sure that our work stuff was on there too, so that we knew that, if you were recording a lecture or you were having a live chat with your students, I knew that I couldn't have a meeting with a client there, or I couldn't talk to one of my editors during that time. And that got a little busy and challenging at times.
Yeah. It was even harder at the start of summer because I co-teach in the fall, my co-instructor has 2 small children. And so we were trying to record as many of the lectures we both had to record at the same time early enough so that we'd have time to edit those, because those require a bit more editing. But we're scheduling around your work schedule, my work schedule, her work schedule, plus online kindergarten and online speech therapy. And finding a time when everybody's light is good and everybody's home is quiet. Like, I feel like we hit like a few magic hours in the middle of June where we got all of those done, but I don't know how we did it.
I know in so many ways, a lot of these difficulties or challenges that faculty are dealing with in terms of transitioning their classes to online or hybrid versions is just the sheer amount of uncertainty, right? And this is certainly not something only faculty are dealing with. This is kind of our world right now. But in terms of how it's affecting teaching, I know university administrators are often delaying making decisions, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for less good reasons. Those decisions often change at the last minute, and faculty are kind of like, wait, what do I need to be doing now? Obviously parents are dealing with uncertainty about whether their kids are going to be home and if they need to participate in their homeschooling or their online education in any way. I know you and a lot of your colleagues are being asked to prepare multiple versions of a class, prepare the purely online version alongside the hybrid version, alongside the just in case we happen to all be on campus, that's not going to happen version, and like some other weird combo of things. And I'd like to talk about that uncertainty because it shapes how we approach teaching and how we can approach really any of our jobs these days. So what are some of the ways that you've tried to decrease the amount of uncertainty that you're facing? And how has that helped you design your fall semester?
Yeah, I think that Temple didn't decide to go online until after spring break, whereas most other institutions decided during or right before. And so I spent all of spring break pretty sure that we were going to go online, but nobody had said anything. They're just like, just in case, make some contingency plans. And so I spent spring break like figuring out how I could move my class online, and then imagining every single week moving forward, if we were in person, if it's some weird hybrid, if we're totally online. And then as soon as we went fully online, which Temple told us on Monday to get ready for the possibility. And then Wednesday night by like 6 p.m. said, by the way, we're moving online starting next Monday, get ready. And so it's like, okay, well, I'm ready. But it was super stressful, but it helped that I had sort of worked through what it would mean for me. And so before the spring semester ended, I, along with my co-instructor, went to our chairs and are like, we know we can make really good versions of online classes if we have the summer to do it. We also know that we cannot pivot to co-taught classes in addition to our other solo classes simultaneously if we move online suddenly. Like, we need to plan ahead. And like our co-instruction planning always happens months in advance because we both have very different schedules and we both have very different teaching loads. My co-instructor is a non-tenure track faculty member, and so she has more classes than I do. And so like we need to get everything together. And fortunately, I had very understanding chairs who, we had to have a meeting discussing what the plan was. They wanted to make sure, that the students weren't going to be disadvantaged by us moving online, that we thought of all of the contingencies and how we would include students who don't have high-speed internet access or who might even be in a different country, because we have, especially in our MA program, we have a lot of international students. And we had thought of that. We had planned it. And I mean, in addition to reducing my uncertainty, because I'm very much of a type A, plan everything in advance, like even if this wasn't a pandemic, my lectures would have been prepped by the end of July for fall regardless. Like they probably would have been prepped by the end of June if I didn't have to record them. Like that's just the kind of planning I do. But also for my co-instructor, I mean, she still doesn't know what school for her children is going to be like in the fall. They still haven't made a final decision for the school that her kids go to. And so like, having to plan for potentially online kindergarten, first grade versus as well as possibly online, possibly in-person classes was a lot. And so I was like, well, at least we can minimize these 2 classes for you and make sure these are ready to go. I think that there's also, a lot of the concern for us moving online sort of preemptively before the university made a decision is that there are a lot of vocal students who hate online learning. And I have to say that I blame faculty for that, because faculty have also poo-pooed online learning. Like we disparage online learning on a regular basis, despite the fact that we are constantly asked in a survey every single semester whether or not we'd be willing to develop any of our classes to be online classes. Like we've been asked that question every year since I've been at Temple, how willing we would be to move to teach online. And there are reasons faculty have been resistant that are good, and that's around questions of intellectual property and who owns the class. And if I record all of my lectures and put them online, and then you give it to somebody else to teach, and they're teaching with my videos that I created, but I'm not getting paid for it. Like those are questions that the university really has never answered. But there are others that are just like, I just don't like it, or it's not as good. Or, I mean, I've had so many people I know this summer talk about how awful online learning is. And I was like, yeah, but for some people, that's what they get. That's the option. I mean, it's harder, it's different, but it's not bad necessarily. And I think that getting out of that mindset of online is somehow lesser is one of the things that helped me anyway, and helped my co-instructor think about what's good about moving online and focus developing our classes in ways that are better than just trying to adapt what we had done in the classroom and move it to Zoom.
I mean, so much about that online teaching conversation, both the kind of easy dismissal or the simplistic dismissal of it, or the figuring out what works about it and how can we make it work for, your individual situation, is about accessibility, right? And I know accessibility is obviously a concern for any university classroom, or it should be. But I think the expansiveness of that term and of that concept has really been brought home and become kind of more salient in this current transition to online and hybrid classes. And disability activists have been fighting for these issues and for the right to online education for decades and to make it better. But I know for folks who don't have any experience with disability activism or disability justice, they're often learning about these things for the first time. And for instance, they're learning that things like childcare are accessibility issues. Scheduling of classes or class meetings is an accessibility issue. Internet speed and who has it and who doesn't. And when can you access the internet and through what kinds of devices is an accessibility issue. Video captions, transcripts, making your course content and even the websites that you're posting that course content on ADA compliant are perhaps a little more straightforward in the sense that people without experience with disability activism might have heard of those issues, right? But faculty are still trying to figure out how to actually do those, often without a lot of support from administration, who often just sends them to the disability office website and says, do this, without any kind of well, what does that mean in this context? And how do you actually do that? How do you generate video captions? Where are you supposed to post transcripts? What about childcare? That's not on the disability, student website, things like that. So how are you addressing accessibility in your teaching? And then maybe what kind of support do you wish that more faculty got around the kinds of accessibility issues that this transition to online teaching is raising?
Yeah, So, I mean, I think there are a few things. Several years ago, in conversation with other faculty, like I realized that my lateness policy was built around the lateness policy I had just grown up with, which was it's due at that time and no excuses, and unless you're dying or something like that. I don't think I ever phrased it that way, but like that version of like very draconian, like due dates are due dates. And I, realized that that was one, it wasn't necessarily true. Like I realized, especially in conversations with my friend Katia, who teaches at Mount Holyoke, we were talking about the fact that like we don't want on time crappy papers if getting another 24 hours would have led to a better paper, right? Like the due date is, explaining to students that the due dates are in place so that I can plan my time. I know that I'm getting a batch of papers in at this day at this time, so I've scheduled it into that week that I have grading to do so that I can plan the rest of my life around it. And then I adopted this very lenient lateness policy, which is basically no penalty. Just tell me by the due date and time that you can't get it into me, and tell me when you are going to get it into me. And I have to say that I think it's been 5 years of using that now, I've rarely had a student ask for more than, say, 48 hours. And I've rarely had students who needed an extra extension on top of that. And usually in those cases, it's because other more serious things are going on. And I mean, it was in a policy that seems really minor, but it actually means a lot to students, because for students who do have disabilities or have children who need to go to the hospital, right? Like I've had many students with kids need to ask for, an extra couple of days because their kid's sick and they have to go to work and deal with other things. And like, it's just a very easy thing. I only need to know that you'll get it to me eventually. I don't need to know why. I don't need to know, all of your personal information to give you the benefit of an extra few hours to work on this paper that I'm going to grade later. And then same way a few years ago, and it's worked to lesser, better, or worse extents for some classes, I realized that so in large part because we had a mumps outbreak on campus a couple of years ago, I instituted a new policy where, like, if you can't physically make it to class, as long as you tell me with enough notice that I can get the tech set up, you can Skype into class. And I had one student who was a single mom do that semester, where she'd either bring her kids and have them hang out at the computer lab near the classroom, or she'd Skype in because she or one of her kids was really sick. And like, it wasn't ideal because the Wi-Fi in that room was terrible, but it was an option for her, and it meant she didn't miss the entirety of class. The semester after that, I had a grad student who lives a couple hours away from the city, who was adjuncting at one university close to where he lives, and then jumping on a train and taking it to campus for my class, and then jumping back on a train and getting home at like 2 a.m. to wake up at 6 a.m. to go teach a different class. And I was like, or you could Skype in. And him Skyping in made it that he could participate in the class. It worked really well. Because they were grad students and because they were friends, I could set one student was basically in charge of calling him in and maintaining that connection. So like I could lead class, because that's one of the harder things about having students Skype in, is that I'm simultaneously troubleshooting the internet connection while teaching. But it was the reason he was able to take that class and fully participate in it. And it's also, and that in turn led to how I designed my online teaching, is like, this class can work even if you can't physically make it. I also, if students are sick, they can Skype in or Zoom in rather and participate, even if they're not really talking, right? They can just listen to us, and that's fine. I think that for me, the making the class work, meeting students where they are and making the class work in that way, it's not actually that hard. It just requires, thinking through why my policies were policies, or why my assignments were structured that way, and rethinking, what are the things that actually matter to me in terms of what students do, and what are the things that these are just rules that, attendance policies or lateness policies, that a lot of those had just been like copied over from things I'd experienced or other people's syllabi I've seen, or what my colleagues are doing, and then trying to figure out like, what do I actually care about? And I think that helps make the classes a bit more accessible to more students. At least that's what they've told me. I think in terms of, in terms of online teaching, I'll say for me, as somebody who has chronic pain issues and migraines and insomnia that makes both of those things worse, like online teaching's actually been really good for me because I don't spend an hour round trip walking to campus. So if I am having a particularly painful day or particularly sleepless night, it's easy for me to, go upstairs and lie down in bed for a few minutes in between classes, rather than try to get in a couple of minutes of sleep on my office floor, which I have done on many occasions. It's not a very comfortable floor. Or like the fact that I can record everything over the summer. So I know my lectures are solid. I know the content that I need my students to get is there. And so if I get sick, or if the internet goes down, or if something else happens, or if I just get a really bad migraine, the bulk of the class can run even if I'm not having a good day. And I think that was something that I tried to work into my design of my classes, is that I don't have to worry about canceling the live session if the live session is bonus. When it comes to what I wish universities would do, I mean, our Center for the Advancement of Teaching has a lot of great people in it and a lot of great technicians in it. But every single session I went to this summer, I was required to do online teaching training this summer. Every session I went to, when I asked an accessibility question, I was told to go speak to the DRS office. And I was like, yeah, but the DRS office can't control the fact that the learning management software we use and have a contract with doesn't have accessibility tools built into it, right? That the VoiceThread app that's supposed to be great and that a lot of the various trainings covered and seems like a very interesting tool. The only way it can have closed captioning is if you transcribe the talk yourself and upload them. And I was like, or I could use YouTube, And so for me, I've decided to use YouTube for my classes because YouTube auto captions, and they're pretty good auto captions. I mean, some of the biggest issues are with author names or with, my poor enunciation. But I can go in very quickly and edit those to make sure that they're correct. But it means that, regardless of whether or not my students are deaf or hard of hearing, sometimes maybe they just want to watch the video with the sound off, and that's fine too. They can just read the words. But it's easy enough to do automatically rather than what I've gotten a lot of advice from the university for is just do it if you have a student who needs that. And I don't think that that's necessarily right, because not every student who needs it will ask, and not every student who needs it has access to, will have, if we're not on campus, have access to the DRS office. And the DRS office, like I've spoken to those folks before, and they're overwhelmed. Like they are short-staffed and are dealing enough with trying to figure out what students need that they don't have, a dedicated office to accessibility technology. I mean, if DRS and CAT could get together and have an office that is dedicated and has technicians who can help faculty do these things rather than say, yeah, we have a computer lab that has that software that will transcribe your videos, but you have to go there and do it yourself. Like a lot of faculty won't do that. And, on the one hand, I think faculty should take responsibility for making sure their materials are accessible. But on the other hand, we're all basically working for free this summer redoing all of our teaching, that if there were a centralized office that it could at least give better advice on how to make these individual things accessible, that would be super helpful. In the same way that we've had students who are blind or have very limited visual capabilities, and whatever software some production class is using doesn't work with screen reader software. And it becomes a question of whether or not the student needs to drop the class or the class needs to pick a different software. And those two things shouldn't be the fight, right? Where a class is built around learning a specific tool that is used in the industry, and the student can't use it, so that student doesn't get to learn how to do this thing. Or, this industry standard that the other students are learning because it's an industry standard. Like maybe we need to fight with the company that is producing this industry standard software to make it accessible, right? Like we can advocate on behalf of our students in that way. Sorry, that was kind of long and rambling.
But it's a complex issue, right? And I think that's one thing that I'm seeing a lot of conversations, a lot of thoughtful conversations around, is that a kind of narrow understanding of what accessibility means just doesn't work. It's never worked, as disability activists have long been screaming at the top of their lungs about. But it encompasses more things than I think a lot of non-disabled people are used to thinking about, right? In terms of time, in terms of space, in terms of labor, in terms of intellectual property, in addition to the perhaps more well-known issues of, transcripts or captioning or things like that, which also, as you point out, still need a lot of work.
Yeah, I mean, there's also like the idea that faculty themselves don't need accessibility concerns addressed. I mean, the move online kind of presumed that all faculty members were able to see and hear adequately enough to do a Zoom class. Like all of the advice, every single bit of advice has presumed that you are normatively bodied, that you are in a heteronormative relationship. I mean, there are lots of there's one session I went to where they were talking about like the getting to know you video to introduce yourself to your students and the fact that you're teaching from home, and like they're advising you to like show them your kids. And I was like, or not. I mean, we don't have kids, but once they heard him barking, my students wanted to meet our dog, but like, I don't think it's our job to, display who we are as humans to students necessarily. That can be something people want to do, but for that to be, best practice advice seems really weird to me.
It's very exclusionary, right? It presumes a certain kind of normative family space, home space, living space, familial situation that that most people in the world don't even have, right? Just numerically, as well as most people aren't inherently comfortable with sharing, both on faculty and student side, right?
Exactly. I mean, I've seen so many people, less in, I don't think really in my department, but on some of the online teaching sessions or in various online teaching groups where people are like, I really want my students to turn on their cameras so I can see them. And it's like,
oh God.
But if they don't want to, that should be fine. Or there are lots of reasons students don't want to put their face on a camera, right? And for whatever reason, it's fine. There are a lot of reasons they'll have their microphone muted until they're actually talking. And actually that should just be a go-to for everybody. Always mute your microphone if you're not talking. Doing otherwise.
It's like life lessons.
Or there was a how to be professional on Zoom thing that Temple was sending around. It was through the Temple News. So it was from the student paper, but it was getting sent around to all the departments. And one of the examples was to use a Zoom background to hide whatever your space looks like, because a student was zooming into class from their tub because it was the only private, quiet place they had. And I was like, no, the answer should be that student doesn't need to use their camera if the only private place they have is a bathroom and they don't want people to see them there. Like that, it doesn't have to be like you have to wear a suit and tie to take class on Zoom.
On that issue of accessibility and kind of students' faces being on camera or not, I know one thing that some folks are running into is there are some faculty who record live conversations with students, right? The kind of live class session, whatever format that looks like, which sometimes means recording students, not just themselves, depending on how you have Zoom set up, right? So if you're recording a video that includes student faces, I mean, that just raises all kinds of issues around intellectual property to start, right? Who owns that video? Does your school own that video? Do you, the faculty member, own that video? What happens when it's not just your face and your life and your home in that video, when it's those of your students? Did they consent to that? Where are you sharing this? Are you putting it on YouTube, either unlisted or public? Are you putting it in the school's learning management software? And who owns that content? I mean, just the amount of issues that raises is just staggering. And I think it's something that a lot of those faculty just don't think about. Like, I don't think they're inherently making conscious, terrible decisions, but they're making unconscious, terrible decisions.
But I think that's the biggest takeaway, right? Is that you have to think about why you're doing the thing you're doing. And I think that there were a lot of faculty who were just recording it because somebody showed them that that's what you can do on Zoom.
Yeah.
And they just set that as the default when they set up their meetings. And in some cases, never inform students that that's what they're doing, and would record it to the cloud on Zoom and then have it up, because the only way you can get it to upload directly to Canvas is if you record to Zoom's cloud. And I was like, there are so many levels of issues with that. that, I mean, and I've gone on rants at faculty meetings and have, shut down email threads back and forth when people were suggesting how to record things. I mean, because we're in Pennsylvania and it's a two-party consent state, like I lean very heavily on that. Like when people ask why I do or don't record various events that we've done internally on Zoom, it's like, unless every single person agrees, we're not going to record this. And also if the thing that needs to be recorded is my lecture, I'm just going to do that separately. There's no need to record that on the fly. And I mean, not just from a student privacy perspective, but, one of the reasons I know that people don't record and upload to YouTube is because they're people who've been targeted for harassment on the internet. And, nothing I'm recording is something I'm worried about, angry people on the internet getting a hold of. But other people are. And in particular, at public talks, I know several colleagues at other institutions have had students record their teaching and upload it to the internet so that other people can talk about what horrible people they are. And it leads to very virulent harassment of them. And so recording a live lecture where people aren't thinking about every word that's coming out of their mouth is something that can set different faculty up for things like harassing emails, things like harassing phone calls, things like attention from right-wing news media outlets, and up to and including people getting fired for those things. And so it's not just we have to be cognizant of what it is we're recording and leaving traces of with regards to our teaching, just like we have to do in terms of our scholarship or our online presence generally. And so I think that's an added layer of concern that a lot of people advising online teaching don't think about is, what am I opening myself up to if this is the thing I record? Now, the way I've recorded my own lectures, none of that is stuff I'm worried about being online for. But I think that that's something people need to consider as they decide how and what they're recording and making available. Because even if you just put it on Canvas, students can download that. You can't control what happens to the content you put out there. And so I think being more thoughtful about what gets recorded isn't just a privacy issue. It can also be a safety issue.
So obviously, as everyone is pivoting in some way, form, or shape their fall semester, they're also trying to figure out how to and in what way to address the context that made that pivoting necessary, right? Obviously, COVID-19, but also the kind of broader the global uprising against police violence, the broader political and economic and cultural structure that is producing the world that we're living in right now. And I know that you teach in an interdisciplinary program, you teach media studies, you teach fields that are about current events in many ways. So bringing current events into your syllabi and your classroom is nothing new. You've always done that. And indeed, all social justice oriented fields work like this, right? But I'm curious how, in particular with regards to the global uprising and COVID, how are you kind of integrating those as topics into your teaching? So whether that's readings on it or a specific discussion scheduled about it or something like that, but also how are those things shaping your classroom space and kind of how you're organizing the structural elements of your class?
I mean, to the structural elements, I think that's a large part why I've designed it so that it can kind of run even if I get sick, but also that students can still engage with it even if they get sick. There are ways for them to continue and to engage. It's built in that if you miss some things here or there, you're not going to fail the course, right? But it's also built in that it's easy to catch up whenever you feel up to catching up. I think in terms of COVID, especially for mobile media, Laura and I were actually very specifically decided to not make the assignments about COVID and quarantine because we felt like, one, students will probably be overwhelmed with that in other classes. And also a lot of the spring production projects pivoted to talk about quarantine. And so we wanted to sort of give them a bit more space to move with it. But it is about mobility and thinking about there's we do an augmented reality project where they're making augmented postcards of a place they are or a place they want to be. We know that people can't travel the way that they used to be able to travel. We know that students might not be able to go do projects that allow them to take pictures in various different places. So like there's some freedom in that to play around with what you do have access to. Or for there's a mobile audio project where they make a audio story about a space they do have access to and objects within that space that's meant to, take the listener to that space. Whereas what the project was last year was a sound walk, which is an audio project designed to be experienced within a specific physical space. And so while the actual skill set of the assignment isn't different, the concept of the project had to be different because students won't be able to physically be in the same space. And then the video project is a project exploring the idea of what it means to be mobile and what that idea evokes to people. Like, what is the idea of mobility to people? And some students might talk about that in terms of life in quarantine, and others might talk about it in terms of the ongoing protests in Philadelphia, and other students might think of it in terms of the trip they wish they could have taken. Like there are lots of different ways students can go with it. And so forcing them not to talk about that was something that was important to us. In terms of the Black Lives Matter and the ongoing protests against police globally, I mean, that's actually been a topic in my classes as long as I've taught at Temple, because this is the place that I've been teaching mobile media and technology and culture, where I've had a unit on cop watching in both of those classes on and off over the years, in different on and off depending on what different configurations the class is in. And so while the pre-recorded lecture and the reading is about cop watching generally, in the discussion we can talk about it in specific in terms of what's happening now. And I think that that's important to me, to not just treat what's happening as current events, but as things that come up again and again, right? So cop watching and police brutality have been issues. They've always been issues. And they're things that we can talk about in relation to technology for many, many years, and then also talk about what's different now or what particular things are happening now. So for me, I've always relied on either supplemental readings like optional news articles or videos to show that talk about current events, but always connecting them to things that are sort of perennial in the course makes it easier to show students that these are structural issues, not like the special of the day issue.
So this brings me to my last question, my favorite question that really gets at the heart of this podcast. And it's a question that has certainly taken on a kind of new frame in the past recent months. But I'm also curious how it applies to kind of how you're approaching pedagogy in this moment. And so the question I usually ask is, what's the world that you're working towards? What kind of world do you want in as broad and big and exciting of a sense as you want to take that? So I definitely want to hear your answer to that. But I'm also curious, maybe what's the world that you're wanting for this new form of pedagogy? What kind of radical pedagogy or feminist pedagogy or social justice oriented pedagogy are you working towards when you are designing your classes?
I think that for me, it's the goal of my teaching and the goal of my research is to encourage people to figure out how to make the world better for other people, not just themselves. And I think that thinking about the bigger structural issues, the longer historical issues, and thinking about how we talk about things, making the world harder for different kinds of people is something that I encourage my students to think about. And it's also what I think the goal of the changes I've made to my teaching over the years, but also the things I see people changing about their teaching right now is about, which is how do we make education work for the greatest number of people? And how do we make it work for people by default rather than by exception? And I think that, Temple recently released new guidance on language for syllabi that include things that I've had in my syllabi for a decade at this point. Things like a code of conduct that's not just this like amorphous be be good student code of conduct, or we will kick you out of university, which is like, be kind to other people, think about other people. I mean, the syllabus language we were given talks about that in terms of mask wearing, but it doesn't have to be just in terms of mask wearing. It can also be in terms of discussion board posts or how you respond to your classmates. They also include language about acknowledging difference and making things more accessible and being lenient with students who are having a hard time. And I'm like, yeah, I've been doing that. So, I mean, part of me is like, I'm glad to see other people's teaching becoming more like what I and people I admire's teaching has become like. And I hope that it doesn't go backwards. I hope that it keeps going in that direction. Because I think that on the one hand, there are very real worries that this move to online teaching and the crashing economy will result in fewer secure jobs in academia. And that's totally true. But I also think that the way we're approaching this move to online teaching can also make academia more accessible to more people. And that's the thing that we have to hold on to as faculty members, not the we can be replaced, but the we can make ourselves available to more people more readily in different ways using these technologies.
Well, thank you so much for being here in our own house on this episode in this unusual but kind of fun version of Imagine Otherwise.
Yes, your office is the one with the air conditioning, so I would like to open my door now.
Okay. Thanks for listening to another episode of Imagine Otherwise. Imagine Otherwise is produced by Ideas on Fire, and this episode was created by Christopher Prasad and myself, Cathy Hannabach. Audio editing was provided by the awesome folks at Pro Podcast Solutions. You can check out the show notes and transcript for this episode on our website at ideasonfire.net, where you can also read about our fabulous guests and find links to the people and projects we discussed on the show.